Sony 24-70 versus Tamron 35-150. Which one is the better mid-range lens? Today, we're gonna figure that out. So the 35-150 has been my go-to mid-range lens for about 2 years, and I bring it with me on every single shoot. But recently, I picked up the 24-70, even though the 35-150 covers pretty much what the 24-70 does and a little bit more. Today, I'm going to talk about why that is. I will have timestamps for this video so you can jump around to different sections. So obviously, let's start off with the focal length, which is going to be the biggest difference. Looking at the wide end of 24mm versus 35mm, 35mm I would probably consider on the upper limit of a wide angle lens. If you're going above a 35, I don't really consider that wide angle anymore, but 35 is still very usable in a lot of situations. However, if you are doing a lot of indoor shoots, I would prefer to shoot with a 24mm on the wide end, because in indoor situations it can get a little bit cramped and 35 just doesn't seem wide enough for me sometimes. However, on the telephoto end, you're getting 70mm versus 150mm, which is almost double what the 24-70 has, and that's obviously the biggest attraction for the 35-150. Now 24-70 is still a great range. It's been probably the go-to mid-range lens for like decades. You're obviously going to get a lot of flexibility with it, it's wide enough to shoot indoors, and still zoomed in enough to give you some compression. However, my problem with the 24-70 is that it's very standard and a lot of the shots may look a little bit generic. However, the 35-150 is special because it gives you so much flexibility with the range. Again, 35mm you can still shoot indoors with it, and if you're outdoors, a lot of the times 35 is still good enough, but 150 gives you so much more compression that it almost starts to look like a baby 70-200. I actually did have a 70-200 before, and I actually sold that because the 35-150 pretty much covered what I needed on that zoomed in end, but still gave me that mid-range look, being able to go as wide as 35. And what's cool about these is that the shots don't look as generic as a 24-70. When you crank this and zoom in all the way to 150, the images start to look amazing, you get a lot of compression. The 35-150 is actually going to be way more versatile because it gives you about 115mm of focal length, while the 24-70 only gives you about 45mm. And if you end up getting the 24-70, you might still miss a little bit of compression and you might end up getting a 70-200 or a longer telephoto prime lens down the line. But again, like I mentioned with the 35-150, I actually think it covers the mid-range lens as well as the longer lens with the 70-200, so it almost counts as two lenses in one, and I feel like it's way more versatile and the shots that you get from it actually look way better. In fact, for weddings, I run dual cameras, so on one camera I have the 35-150, and then on the other camera I have a 24mm prime lens, and that effectively helps me fill in the 24mm wide look that I'm missing from the 35-150, but then gives you so much flexibility being able to zoom in that much. So I'm pretty much getting the best of both. Now let's talk about the build quality of these lenses. So the Sony 24-70, this is their G Master series, so obviously it's going to be very well built. It has two custom buttons, you get an aperture ring, autofocus manual focus toggle, the zoom and the focus range just feel super smooth. You also get an iris lock. So everything about this feels very premium. Now Tamron on the other hand, Tamron is always known to be very value, and while their build quality is good, I wouldn't say it's amazing. You're still getting a lot of features. You have 3 custom buttons, you have 3 custom modes I can switch between, you have autofocus manual focus switch, but that's about it. You don't get any aperture rings, the rings just don't feel as good, the focus ring does still feel smooth, but the zoom ring is actually very stiff. I even got lucky, my zoom ring is a little bit looser, but my friend's lens on the 35-150, his zoom ring is actually very stiff, which is kind of annoying sometimes. Now let's talk about aperture and low light. Now the 24-70 has a fixed f2.8 aperture, which is pretty good in low light. I actually don't recommend any lenses that don't go wider than f2.8, at least for this general mid-range focal length. Again, this is a pretty standard focal length and aperture combo, so it's going to be pretty good. Now the 35-150 is actually pretty special because it has a variable aperture of f2 to 2.8. So on the wide end of 35mm, you can actually go down to f2. At about 50mm, it goes to f2.2, and then everything after that goes to f2.8. Now that might not sound like a lot, but if you're doing a lot of shooting in low light, 35mm at f2 compared to f2.8, you're actually getting an extra stop of light. And that might be the difference between shooting at 6400 ISO and 12800 ISO. It also helps give you a little bit more background blur if you want to shoot portraits at 35mm at f2. Let's talk about sharpness. The 24-70, obviously top of the line lens, this lens is extremely sharp. And I don't think you can really complain about anything here. The 35-150, the image quality is very good, but it's definitely nowhere near as sharp as the 24-70. That isn't to say though that the 35-150 is soft. The sharpness is probably going to be good enough for most people, but if you are looking for the maximum sharpness, the 24-70 definitely takes the win. For focusing speed, the 24-70 is super quick, especially because it's a Sony native lens. Sony native lenses always just seem to work a little bit better with Sony cameras, which makes sense. I found this lens to be extremely reliable with tracking and autofocus, and I have no problems with this. The 35-150 I found is pretty good at tracking people and tracking faces, but as soon as I start to focus it on objects, I have found it to be a little bit glitchy sometimes. It can be a little bit hit or miss, and sometimes I do find myself switching to manual focus and just focusing myself, which can be a little bit annoying sometimes if you're doing a lot of product shoots or you're someone who relies very heavily on autofocus. If you look at the size difference of these, you can definitely see that the 24-70 is way smaller. Both of these have barrels that extend out, and that's definitely the biggest downside to the 35-150. The 24-70 is coming in at 700 grams, the 35-150 is coming in at almost 1200 grams, so it's almost double the weight. Now I am used to carrying camera rigs, so I've gotten used to the weight of the 35-150, but for people who are more used to carrying prime lenses, they might not be used to this and it might be a little bit too heavy for you. Because the 35-150 is so heavy and because the barrel extends so much, I did find it a little bit trickier to balance on a gimbal, which is actually one of the main reasons why I bought the 24-70, because I just needed something that's a little bit lighter for gimbal use. If you're someone who does a lot of product shots but you don't own a macro lens, the 24-70 is actually really good at close focusing. Obviously it's not going to be as good as a dedicated macro lens, but you can actually go really close. And if you look at these images, this is the closest you can get at 24mm as well as 70mm. While the 35-150, you're definitely not going to be able to get as close. And this is how close you can get at 35mm versus 150mm. Price is obviously going to be also one of the deciding factors on what lens you get. The 24-70, this is the G Master series, so it's going to be the top of the line. This comes in at about $2,400 USD. Now, if you want to go a little bit cheaper, Sigma also makes a very great 24-70. That comes in at about $1,300 USD, so it's very affordable compared to this one. Obviously, it's not going to be the same. That lens is a little bit heavier. The focusing might not be as good as a Sony native G Master lens, but it still is a very good option if you're looking for something in the 24-70 range. Now the 35-150 comes in at $1,700 USD, so a little bit more expensive than the Sigma 24-70, but actually way cheaper than the Sony 24-70. And that actually makes this very good value for the amount of range that you're able to get. So now which one is actually better? If you're someone who does a lot of gimbal work, or if you know that you really need the 24mm wideness, the 24-70 is going to be the way to go. You're going to get very good image quality, very sharp, fast at focusing, and again, the 24-70 has been the industry standard mid-range focal length for many years, so you know that if you're going to get this, you're going to get great shots. However, I think that if you don't need the 24mm wideness, or you know that you don't need to put on a gimbal, I would highly recommend checking out the 35-150. Like I mentioned, the shots that come out of these are just insane. It doesn't look as generic as a 24-70 because you're able to get so much compression at 150mm, and it's actually way more versatile because you're able to get about 115mm of focal length versus about 50mm on the 24-70. Even for me, unless I know that I don't want to be carrying as heavy of a lens for the day, or if I need to put on a gimbal, the 35-150 is going to be my go-to every single time. The 24-70 I still feel lacks a little bit of compression, and if you're going to get this, you might end up wanting a 70-200 or maybe a longer telephoto prime lens later down the road, where the 35-150 pretty much covers that. But I want to know what you think. Which one of these do you think is a better mid-range lens? If you have any questions, let me know down in the comments below. If you like this video, remember to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to see more photo video content, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.